Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's pretty late at night on Sunday, the 14th, Mother's Day, and I'm just making this video real quick to talk a little bit about the colonial period and materialism. And I figured that today this will be pretty short, but I just want to accomplish two things. Number one, I want to define materialism, and number two, I want to talk a little bit about materialism in the early American period. And, those are both things that I think we should probably do right off of the get-go here. So let's start with defining what materialism is. If you think about the word sort of grammatically, right? Materialism, isms, they tend to be frames of mind, ways of thinking. And these ways of thinking, these frames of mind that we have, tend to define our worldviews. They oftentimes are the things that kind of drive us, to behave the way that we do. You will forgive me, I have a bit of a cold at the moment. From things like theism, which is the belief in God, or atheism, which is belief that there is no God, or agnosticism, the belief that you do not know if God exists or if he does not. These isms drive us. Capitalism drives the way that we produce and the way that we buy and sell, the way that we work. Socialism, communism, Marxism, fascism, all of these isms are ways of being. Chauvinism, egalitarianism. We could talk about isms forever. And in fact, you could do an entire 491W class on just different isms and how they function. But for this one, we've chosen materialism. And I'm back. Slight change of venue. I was recording on my front porch and it was awfully cold. So anyway, welcome to my home. So if these isms help to define who we are and how we behave, then let's talk about what materialism is, what it means to us, and how it defines us, how it, really, what does it mean? Give you a second to think about that. Feel free to pause the video and contemplate for a few moments. When I look at the word or the phrase materialism, I always break it down into material and then ism being a belief in or a worldview of, and the other part being simple, the material, the physical. So this is one way that we can look at materialism. Any of you with a background in philosophy, this should be old hat to you. This notion that for some people we simply believe in the physical world only, and there is nothing beyond it. There is no supernatural, there is no paranormal, no extrasensory. It's all things that are physical, atoms, molecules, all the way down to quarks and all of that fun stuff in physics that we're not going to talk about because, no, we're not in that field. So, materialism in that sense is certainly a direction that we could take this class. However, it's a highly philosophical direction that we would end up going. And while I'd be game for it, not a lot of people are. Most people would rather talk about sort of the second definition of materialism, and that is this centering of our focus and our interest on things, material things, and what they mean to us. So we'll call someone materialistic if they are really interested in driving the nicest car and having the biggest house and wearing, the fanciest clothing and eating the finest foods. That person might be disparagingly called a materialist. I try to stay away from the disparaging aspect of this, though, because I'm one of these crazy people who believe that our job is not to be cultural critics, and not really, to tell people how they ought to behave and what they ought to believe, but instead to describe what we see and to try to make sense of it, to try to interpret, as Clifford Geertz, famous anthropologist, once said, the webs of significance that we ourselves have spun. These things that we buy, these things that we sell, these things that we trade for and that we purchase, the materials, they're important for more reasons than just because of what they are. I'm sitting in my house right now at my dining room table, and this dining room table has been in my family, I don't know, maybe 30 years now. My parents got it when they moved from their sort of starter home, which was a really dreadful little brick house down in Columbia Borough, to a location within Columbia Borough, but it was uptown instead of downtown, and they got this nice new table to go with that. And now that table is in my dining room, and so, you could look at this table and say, well, it's just a bunch of pieces of wood and a little bit of metal and those kinds of things that hold it all together. It's carved, but it's not super fancy. I mean, it's nothing special that way. And yet, for me, this material has meaning far beyond just wood and screws and, chairs, and it's not just a place to eat. In fact, I eat very rarely at this table, because a lot of times during the semesters I'm running to and fro. But I come back to this table, and this is the table where I took my comprehensive examinations for my PhD, where I wrote those papers. This is the table that I sat around for significant things like Thanksgiving dinners with my family and Christmas with my parents and such. This was where I sat and told my parents, that I was going to be getting married, or that I was going to be a father, or that, this is all of the, those kinds of places, where I sat down and explained to them, okay, Mom and Dad, I'm going to leave the car business. I was a car salesman in the mid-2000s. I had dropped out of college and had gone off and sold cars. And when I told them, that I was going to go back to school, even though I was married and had kids, I was going to, leave the car business, go back to school and try to get a degree in teaching. This was the table that I sat and I talked to them about those things with. So all of those memories and all of the meaning that I associate with this table as a symbol of family, this table as a symbol in my life of sort of pivotal moments, right? That's part of the material. And so when we're looking at materialism, we have to be careful that we don't just treat it as a pejorative term, that we don't just treat it as, material is bad. I'm not of that frame of mind. I don't think anybody who's an adult is really of that frame of mind. Once you, have to pay your own bills and do those kinds of things, you start to be very grateful for the materials that you have, because you work very hard for them, and so when I'm talking about materialism, just keep that in the back of your head. And as you're reading these books and such, what I do want to avoid, and what I think we should all really, just kind of making a statement about American studies, we should all avoid being kind of sanctimonious about this stuff. Like somehow we're also brilliant and we see through the materialism. We see through American culture. And it's just silly. Culture rules everything. We're surrounded by it. We're immersed in it. Again, as Clifford Geertz says, is webs of significance that we ourselves have spun. And we are trapped in those webs. There's nothing we can do to get out of them. We're just in them. And so we're just trying to make sense of it. I just want to take those webs and unwind them a little bit so that I can explain to other people who might not see exactly what's going on, so that I can explain to them what's going on, and then they can make their own decisions. And really be agents for themselves about what they want to do with the culture that's been revealed to them. So anyway, that's my little blurb on materialism itself and how I'm defining it. I'm defining it, yes, as an interest in material things, but I'm staying away from the pejorative aspect of it. And I'm also looking at the idea of material as material writ large. I'm not just looking at it as just purely physical objects. That's certainly a big part of it, and that's a lot of what, when we talk about consumer culture, that's going to be a big focus there. But you could also look at material a little bit differently. You could look at materials as cultural productions, the accumulation of art or music as a form of materialism. Because, again, it comes back to that notion of consuming the materials and producing the materials, whether they be musical materials or whether they be textile materials. All right? So, color quits there. That's sort of point A. Let's look a little bit at the colonial world. As I said in my intro video, if you're not familiar with sort of basic colonial history, certainly grab your old U.S. survey textbook and take a quick look at it, okay? Because it is kind of helpful. But for our purposes, what we're reading is John Winthrop's Arbella sermon and his writings on capitalism and such, which are going to be in like the 1630s. And then we're reading Samuel Danforth's Election Day sermon, which is a few decades later. And then we're reading Perry Miller and his essay, Errand into the Wilderness, which is about the Samuel Danforth sermon. So we're looking just here at Puritan New England and really the 17th century. Now, I have to be honest with you, I can geek out really hard here and just get giddy and start just going a little bit crazy. So if I do, forgive me, but I'll try not to. Puritan New England's fascinating. In large part, it's fascinating to me because the mindset was completely different and is completely alien to most people that I meet today. The hardest part of teaching the U.S. History Survey to me is trying to get across the pre-Enlightenment, pre-modern mindset, this sort of early modern worldview, where all effects have causes, but they're not necessarily physical causes. They can be supernatural causes. So we could talk about things like witchcraft affecting people's lives. We could talk about, God caused the storm. The famous, sort of Protestant winds within 1588 in the English Channel with the Spanish Armada. We talk about God causing those storms, causing that wind, and to someone post-Enlightenment, it's like, well, no, that's not really how that works, because the atmospheric pressure changes, and that's how storms are caused. And yet, in a world where you don't know that that's how storms are caused, you don't know about barometric pressure, right? And you're not thinking that way, you're looking at all effects must have causes. I mean, that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages and frankly all the way back to Greek philosophy, Aristotle and Plato. So this isn't something new. This is not some radical thing that science figured out in the 18th and 19th century. Let's get off of our, modern high horses here and realize that the ancients were not stupid. They were no fools. They knew that effects had causes. They just weren't clear on what those causes were. And when they couldn't find a physical or a naturalistic cause, they went with a non-natural or a supernatural cause. And that's a lot of what you're going to see in New England. If you look at the Arbella sermon, look for the cause and effect relationship that Winthrop tries to lay out about what's going to happen in the Massachusetts Bay Colony if they obey or disobey God. Okay. Secondly, if you look at Winthrop's sort of focus, what is he focusing on? What is he trying to build? Is he trying to build an individualistic world here? Is he trying to is he trying to build something else? Is he trying to build a capitalist world? Is he trying to build, the Soviet Union? Probably not, given that Marx won't come along for like 200 years. But what is he trying to build? What is his purpose? What is his end game there? So that's kind of what you want to be looking at when you're looking at Winthrop, okay? And then when you're looking at Samuel Danforth, realize you're fast forwarding a little bit. And Danforth is not very enthusiastic about the way that this Puritan experiment has gone. The Puritans came here. We oftentimes, we go back and forth. People will say, well, they came for religious freedom and tolerance, and other people will say, no, they didn't, and whatnot. And it's like, okay, guys, look, let's all just calm down, all right? They clearly came for religious freedom for themselves. They were not interested in giving religious freedom to everybody else, as Mary Dyer and a variety of other Quakers and Baptists found out when they tried to practice their version of Protestant Christianity and were either exiled or executed in the case of Mary Dyer. So yes, they came for religious freedom, but religious freedom for themselves, which people will sometimes smirk at and be like, well, that's not religious freedom. And it's like, well, congratulations for applying 21st century values to the 17th century. That's incredibly impressive. No, it's really not. That's really juvenile, actually. It's very juvenile thinking. We want to try to understand cultures and people, right, on their own terms. That's the sort of constant cry that we hear in our culture now, is that we want to try to understand other cultures, through their own lens and their own meaning as much as possible. So I would argue we should do the same thing with the past, and that's part of it. That was funny. Sorry, I had something propping up my phone here as it's recording this video, so my apologies for the disruption there. Regardless, and now I completely have lost my train. No, I have not lost my train of thought. It is back. We are going to try to interpret the past through the lens of the past. We are going to try to understand the Puritans on their own terms. And getting at what's going on with Danforth, you kind of got to understand a little bit of what's going on between Danforth and Winthrop, and between those two times. So Danforth is preaching his sermon and is highly unimpressed with the way that the Puritans have been behaving. What had happened after Winthrop initially set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony, there was this period of expansion, and the city, the town at that time of Boston, became just one town among many. They also set up towns at Salem, at Ipswich, at Dedham, at Andover, at Marblehead, at Gloucester. And these other towns, these other settlements, oftentimes were further away from the preacher. They were further away from the church. And so you end up with this slightly less religious Puritan society than what people often imagine it to be. I mean, we kind of got to get the Puritan thing out of our head to some extent. People will often act like, Puritans had no fun and such. Anybody who's ever spent any time studying them can tell you that's not the case. I have read Puritan love letters between husbands and wives that are extremely explicit. Not quite 50 Shades of Grey kind of levels of explicit, but far more written with far more skill, shall we say, far more poetry. And the reality is you just have to understand the metaphors that are being used. They were very interested in, romantic love, in sex. They enjoyed alcohol. They enjoyed alcohol a lot. They just didn't enjoy public drunkenness. This isn't like a colony of, drunken, college students here, for lack of a better word. This is a colony of people who believe that there's a time and a place for everything and a season for everything under the sun. There is a time to sow and a time to reap, a time to make war and a time to make peace, right? And so all of these different things, whether they be alcohol or sex or whatever, are to be enjoyed, but they are to be enjoyed in a particular context. Sex within heterosexual monogamous marriage, alcohol in the home and in moderation. So the point is, it's not that Boston was this convent where there was, no fun ever taking place and everyone, took a vow of poverty and chastity. In fact, we can tell that this isn't the case because, very simply put, they outgrew themselves very, very quickly. They were having so many children, and the life expectancy was actually reasonably decent, that it became very difficult for the second and third generations to have enough property to make a living. They couldn't farm because you needed enough farmland. And if you're splitting it up between three sons who live, and you only have 40 acres, well, now you've given like 13.3 acres to each surviving son. And of course, there's the widow's third too. The widow got 1/3 of the husband's estate. So the point is, very quickly, these farms become untenable, and business becomes a major pursuit in New England. Fishing, the cod fisheries of New England will provide tremendous wealth, as will the timber. They will become master shipwrights. They'll produce tar. There's not a lot of precious metal mining going on, but there is a lot of timber. There's a lot of textile work. It's good land for sheep. It's also good for farming in small batches or in small doses. It's not plantation-style farming like you get in Virginia, or even the incredibly fertile farmland of south central PA, places like Lancaster County, and Chester County, which are incredibly fertile, actually the best farmland in the United States in terms of production per acre. So they're eking out a pretty harsh living at first, but it only gets worse, and thus they have to diversify. And this will lead them into trade with the Caribbean in terms of sugar, and we'll end up with the triangular trade that we oftentimes hear talked about in U.S. survey classes. Yes, it's an oversimplification, no question about it. But it is a useful way of thinking sort of very quickly on that topic, as they're trading rum and sugar from the Caribbean to New England in exchange for textiles, lumber, tar, pitch, ships, those kinds of things. And you will start to see some slaves coming in. So very quickly, business becomes a major part of New England. And as Winthrop had said in 1630, right, they were sent here, on this errand into the wilderness. He didn't say it that way. He talked about, being a city on a hill, right? Danforth is going to preach his sermon talking about we're on an errand into the wilderness. What is that errand, and are they completing that errand? Or are they actually getting away from it and allowing something else to take its place? We talk about this in terms of the God versus cod, C-O-D. Not Call of Duty, but the fish. God versus cod debates that were taking place. As people who were coming over and were settling in New England were not settling there for religious freedom. They were not Puritans. They were not interested in the religious prescriptions of Cotton Mather and Increase Mather and John Cotton and Winthrop and, all of the founders and Hooker, who eventually moved to Connecticut. They were not interested in any of that. What they came to do was to get away from the oversight that was so prevalent on the mainland of the British Isles. And so the New World became a place of escape. And they weren't really interested in the Puritan mission, the Puritan errand. And so Danforth is asking some questions about what is our errand? What is our new place? And of course, that's what Perry Miller is addressing. Perry Miller is looking at what we call myth and symbol analysis. And we'll end with this very quickly. You all should have probably heard of this by at this point. I would certainly hope so. By the time you're in a 491 class, you should know what myth and symbol is. But just as a refresher, myth and symbol analysis in American studies looks at large-scale ideas as a way to understand smaller-scale ones. That's the myth and the symbol. A good example of a myth might be the myth of the American dream. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody's ever, gone from rags to riches or something like that, or even rags to respectability. Just because we call that the myth of the American dream doesn't mean that it's never happened. What it means, though, is that it has taken on a mythological significance in our public imagination. And so that might be a myth, a symbol of the American dream. Might be the car. I love talking about cars. This is just, I guess because I used to sell them, this has stuck with me. I love talking about cars. The car means so much in our culture. It represents independence. It can represent wealth. It can represent opportunity. It can represent sexual conquest. It can represent 1,000 things to us that all get tied up in this American dream. The house with the white picket fence is a symbol that goes into the myth of the American dream. Okay, in the same way, we can talk about the American character. What is the defining feature of the American character? Now, this is a very old way of looking at this subject, a very old way of doing American studies, not particularly in vogue anymore, though I find myself doing it quite a bit, and just because that's just who I am. But myth and symbol, Perry Miller, the fellow who wrote the essay Errand into the Wilderness that you're reading, is one of the founders of our discipline. And he is one of the sort of key figures in our early years, along with people like Leo Marx and Henry Nash Smith, Vernon Parrington, Lewis Mumford, and such. But Miller is going to argue that it's the Puritan notion of the American self that is going to define us as a people. It's this errand, this city on a hill, this errand into the wilderness to be a special, unique people that is going to define us. And he's going to use the word errand in two different ways. And as you read through it, if you don't fully get where Miller's going, don't feel bad. The first time I read this, I sat back and went, what is he talking about? This makes no sense. So if you get it on your first pass, give it a few days, see if it sticks in your head. But if it does, well then congratulations. Not an easy concept to get, his double meaning for the word errand. But the point is, by the end of the 17th century, right, the Puritan world has begun to collapse. New England is getting increasingly secular. And while it's not going to become secular per se, it's getting less Puritan. You'll see the rise of the Unitarian Church. You'll see the rise of just sort of straight congregationalism rather than separatism like they practiced in the Plymouth colony, or Puritanism as they practiced in the Massachusetts Bay colony. And then, of course, at the end of the decade, at the end of the century, you'll have the Essex County witchcraft crisis, otherwise kind of badly known as the Salem witch trials, which if you ever want to get me in a really long conversation, let's talk about Salem. Actually, it does bear on materialism some, as one of the primary explanations for the witch trials is one that's rooted in property and who wanted whose property. This is Boyer and Nissenbaum's famous